Welcome from Alpha to Omega.
Hello, and welcome to the 12th episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Saturday, the 18th of August 2012, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. Today's show is sponsored by Bill S. Thanks very much for the donation, Bill. If you'd like to help support the show, just click on the donate buttons on the podcast website. You can also join the From Alpha to Omega group on Facebook. Today we'll be speaking to Heiko Khoo. Heiko is a Marxist who has been a speaker at London Speakers' Corner since 1986. He has a special interest in the Marxist analysis and critique of China and former Soviet-type regimes. He frequently contributes to the online journal karlmarx.net, and he has recently begun a walking tour company, marxwalks.com, that runs weekly walking tours in London on the life and ideas of Karl Marx. Our conversation will meander across a number of issues, from Speaker's Corner to political activism in East Berlin, from Trotsky to Old Labour, and from the Occupy movement to the extent of state capitalism and state communism in today's China. The interview was recorded in the lobby of an apartment block, which at times became flooded with Olympic tourists. Hopefully the background noise doesn't interfere too much with your listening pleasure. Can you tell us about how you became to be a speaker at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, London?
Okay, I began speaking in Speaker's Corner after participating in organisational activity at college and in the Labour Party Young Socialists, organising protest movements and demonstrations and things like that, and street theatre, street agitation at the time when Thatcher came to power. So
this is the early 80s?
That was the early 80s, and then after finishing college I returned to London, and in London then I went to Speaker's Corner and just started speaking there. Somehow it was automatic. I'd been there as a little kid with my dad, and so I sort of remembered that, and somehow that got me to go up there.
And what was Speaker's Corner like in the early 80s?
There were quite a powerful group, little lobby of conservative hecklers at the time, who I think powerful. There were about 6 or 7 people who were very conservative in their view. A couple of right-wing Republicans, about 3 or 4 members of the Monday Club, the right wing of the Tory party, and they were quite proficient at heckling people.
Were these MPs?
No, they were just young kids, basically. Because I saw it all as a conspiracy by a load of right-wing Tories, which it wasn't, but it was an alliance of Tories who sort of somehow stuck together like glue and
shit to a blanket.
Yeah, something like that, and they would give me a lot of trouble. I mean, and I would always try and have a rant about some issue or other, quite simple arguments to begin with, but it was difficult because they were capable of undermining you if you didn't know what you were doing and if you didn't try to come to terms with it. So the first year or so was really a battle to get heard at all.
Just to practice being a public speaker?
To get past, well, it's not really practice being a public speaker, it's getting beyond dealing with heckling. That was the issue. It remains the issue to this day, to be honest with you, but at the same time there was a specific type of heckling, a political heckling, and a specific type of humour that they had as well, which you had to learn to deal with, and all the standard heckling, the heckles which have been accumulated over the decades would be hurled at any new speaker, and you had to sort of find your way past that.
And what was the milieu of other speakers there? Was it inherently political, or...?
Not really many political speakers. There was a speaker from the Socialist Party who was a very old guy. He'd met Lenin in 1921, I think, or Harry from the Socialist Party of Great Britain. He was in the Communist Youth in 1919 or so, went over as a delegate to Moscow. He was an efficient speaker about theoretical questions of Marxist economics. He really was quite good. but a bit weak as a speaker because he was really quite old by that time. Then there was Lord Soper, who was a Christian socialist speaker, very powerful speaker. At least when I first got there, he was still a very powerful speaker. His age was increasing, and he did become a bit weaker. His ability to hear the hecklers and then respond appropriately, and that was the most difficult thing, because if he would always get a large audience, but if the audience didn't hear him respond to heckles that came, even if it was just to give a put down, then it tended to lose the strength of the meeting. But he was a very powerful speaker, Shakespearean type character, and very eloquent, very, very eloquent.
So my father was working in London in the 60s, and he used to go down to Speaker's Corner every week, and he said that in those days there could be like 4,000 or 5,000 people that is there to hear maybe Tariq Ali or some other big MP names. But today it seems to be basically dominated mostly by religious speakers. Would that be true?
I think it is. I mean, in the 80s it was never particularly powerfully political. It's a phenomenon of quite modern times that people don't go and speak. Street speaking was the norm for politicians in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, or speaking without a microphone to an audience in a meeting who might heckle you. I mean, I've seen, there was a film a couple of years ago about heckling, which Tony Allen was involved in producing actually, and there was quite a nice piece where it showed Harold Wilson dealing with hecklers in a meeting in a really clever way. And although a lot of politicians do sort of learn that in Parliament, it's still, the street speaking is a bit of a different art, because the general public will respond in a different way to parliamentarians respond, you know. They might be sharp in some things, but the general public will just have that ability to bring you down to earth. In 1 second, there was a famous incident with a Belgrano discussion with Thatcher, where she was brought...
So can you explain what the Belgrano incident was?
Thatcher ordered the shooting of a ship that was moving away from the exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands.
This is during the Falklands War,
during
1982.
the Falklands War, Malvinas, yeah. And there was one woman who came on there who was... I don't know what group she represented, but she was certainly not a known figure in any sense. And she just badgered Thatcher and made Thatcher look stupid. And that type of ability that comes from outside the spectrum of the method of discussion, that's the official sort of Oxford and Cambridge and debating society and parliamentary debating society, has its own characteristic and its own power, which is I think a bit more an affinity to the type of Speaker's Corner arguments you can have.
How did you get into Marx then?
I got interested in Marxism because my father's Chinese, my mother's German, and my mother pushed me to go to East Germany when I was a kid. I was very interested in history, why history of Germany was presented the way it was, why history of China was presented the way it was, and why I was told so much about kings and queens, you know, and because of that I had an interest then in questioning the way things were. And then I met some people who were involved in the youth section of the Labour Party who were Marxists, and from them I gained, when I was about 17, I gained an interest in participating in politics. So it was a mixture of observing East Germany as quite a young kid, that is a different type of society, and seeing that everything was presented there from, like, say, a local museum would be presented in a Marxist historical context, which I think is actually quite clever and quite apposite. And engaging in activities like protests against nuclear weapons and protests about cuts in people's social welfare rights, enforced youth employment schemes and that sort of thing.
So you weren't a punk then?
I wanted to be, but my hair was curly.
I suffer
and they
from
wouldn't
the same
spike
affliction.
my hair. I asked them, and they wouldn't spike my hair without dyeing it black. And of course, I didn't feel I could do that. So in that way, I wasn't a punk. No, I couldn't go that far. No, it didn't come from the music.
Yeah.
No, it didn't.
That was quite powerful in the 70s.
It was. Funnily enough, there were kids in my school who were quite political. Now I look back on it, and I wasn't political like that. They were political in liking the Jam and liking the Sex Pistols and the Clash for the political reasons. That came a little bit later with me.
So you did some work in East Germany. You were there during the reign of Honecker.
I went there as part of this group that I was involved in, used to be called the Militant Tendency. I went there to organise an underground political opposition, or link up with the underground political opposition, and try and create a little group that would present democratic socialist ideas as alternatives to a Stalinist regime. So that was the type of activity I was engaged in. So I went to West Berlin first of all. I used to go across the wall 3-4 times a week to go and try and meet people there, make contact with people there, discuss with people there.
Was it dangerous work?
Well, I mean, it was that you felt it was dangerous because it was Cold War time. Going across the border itself felt dangerous. You know, the way they would look at you at the border felt dangerous. So because you grew up in all that James Bond, spy world environment, you assumed that was what it represented. And it did. I mean, I was under some surveillance. I know that for a fact because I've got a record from the
Stasi.
Well, it's the East German, it's the Ministry for Security, but it was the military section of that. But it would be logical that they had a foreigner under that. Except my registration, the beginning of my card, my record was actually before I moved into East Germany. So they had something on me in West Berlin. But it was quite obvious. I mean, I was going over there quite a lot. It would have been quite rare. I mean, people I knew in West Berlin, they never went to East Berlin. So this idea that everyone wanted unification is a complete lie. Everybody in West Berlin, I didn't know anybody in West Berlin who would go to East Berlin ever.
Why was this? Was it fear, or
they maybe went there once, probably when they were a school child, because it was part of a sort of school trip experience. You go to the East, and then they would never go there again. It was such an alien world for them that if they went over there, they just felt uncomfortable and incapable of dealing with it.
You see the same demarcation, you say, in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Many, like a large percentage of, say, Southerners, even though they might live very close to the border, would never ever go to the north. I live maybe 40 miles from the border, and I've maybe been north 5 times in my life. It's very strange how it happens.
I think that's probably a similar circumstance. I've never been to the north or to Ireland at all. But because West Berlin was enclosed city, it was that much odder in a way. You know, you'd even go underneath East Berlin on the daily trip on the underground from one part of town to the other for your work, and it was just a separate. People were just shut off at that point, and so there was no real connection whatsoever, in spite of what people make out. The East Berliners also didn't really. I mean, they were more likely to talk about how things were in the West. The people in West Berlin never spoke about how things were in the East.
So what type of Marxism were you a part of at the time? Are you a Trotskyite or...?
Yeah, I mean, from a Trotskyist background.
And can you explain that, sir?
Lenin and Trotsky basically led the Russian Revolution, and Trotsky had a number of innovative ideas about what happened after the revolution and why it degenerated into the sort of totalitarian bureaucratic regime that people associate the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and so on with. He had a critique which was democratic on the one side. He believed that the administration of society should be organised by a sort of mass democracy, organised through workplaces and communities, and that...
So this would be the kind of classic libertarian socialism?
Well, not quite, because you couldn't say that Trotsky was a libertarian socialist. He certainly was prepared to use force whenever the regime, if you like, or the state
was threatened.
Internally
and externally?
Both, yes. Yeah. And this was effectively the dilemma that Trotsky, if you like, represented on the one side, because he was one of the leading ministers in the state, represented a process of trying to maintain the revolution, extend the revolution, and bring the insurrection to fruition. Yeah, so the Trotsky's ideas were basically that you would have a mass democracy run by Soviet elections, democratic elections of local workers' councils.
So for Most people don't know that Soviet is actually the name for the workers'
for a workers'
councils.
council, for a sort of strike committee actually. Originally they came out of strike committees. There was, however, a dilemma in Trotsky's development, theoretical development or intellectual development in relation to the Russian Revolution, was that he was the leader of the Red Army. He had to institute measures necessary for fighting a war to maintain the regime in power. On the other side, he advocated an extension or the reconstitution of a revolutionary democracy. But when he advocated this, it was also simultaneously the period in which no one wanted to hear it, and which the...
No one being the Politburo?
Members of the party, generally members of the party and the broad mass of society were not really interested in participating in running society at that time, partly because of a low cultural level, low economic level, and the feeling that there wasn't much they could do to change it. And actually Trotsky in many ways thought that was the case as well. He advocated a different position, but he did understand that actually the process of degeneration had become pretty much an unstoppable process. And all you could do was say how it should be different, but you couldn't actually change it, he believed, unless there was a world revolution, unless there was a revolution in Germany or France that would transform, or Spain, that would transform the balance of forces and reflect back into the Soviet Union.
This is what happened. This is what happened. This is what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. An unstoppable force, 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 an immovable.
In a previous episode, I played a lecture by Chomsky on different forms of government in the future, and one was, he mentioned the unions in England in the 1970s. And some of the major unions, he said in this speech, I was very surprised, I didn't know this, that they had explicitly in their, as a formal part of their constitution was that they wanted worker control of the government workplace. So these were obviously explicitly socialist. How did this play into Thatcher crushing the unions?
There was a powerful trade union movement in Britain, particularly in the period of the late 60s, 90s, early 70s, partly because of the strength of the economy, that a lot of people had employment, therefore you could leave a job quite easily, gives you power over the boss.
Yeah.
Because if they need the workers and you can turn around and say, well, I've been offered somewhere else, and it gives you power vis-a-vis the employers, and there was an organised power in that respect. A lot of workplaces were heavily trade unionised, and the union could extract benefits for the workers by threatening action or taking action. That was a general phenomenon across the whole of Europe. Partly explains the September strikes in Italy in '69, the student revolts and workers' revolts in France in '68 and so on. And that same impact existed in Britain. Dockers defeated the government, the miners defeated the government, and it was in response to that Thatcher's political organisation to break the trade union movement was designed.
So it seemed to me that the use of monetarism and such economic attacks and attack on labour, it seemed somewhat, is a famous expression in football, to get your retaliation in first. Instead of maybe they were afraid of some kind of revolutionary beginnings, they basically decided nearly to have some type of a counter-revolution first and to break the unions.
Yeah, one of the criticisms I have of most Trotskyist groups today is that they focus on a phrase from Trotsky from 1938, which is that the entire crisis of humanity boils down or can be reduced to the crisis of the leadership of the working class. whilst leadership of the working class is an important issue in terms of how you fight, what strategy and tactics you fight for, leadership of the ruling class is also an important issue. They have their own strategy and tactics, and sometimes they're going to win because their strategy and tactics are better than yours, and sometimes they're going to win because the balance of forces is in their favour and their strategy and tactics are better than yours. Or they can win because the balance of forces is in their favour and the strategy and tactics don't matter because the balance of forces is so favourable to them. So you can have a combination of these circumstances. I think Thatcherism was, to some degree, a combination of that. Thatcher represented a certain political orientation, economic orientation to challenge Keynesianism, roll back the welfare state, destroy the trade unions. The workers' movement was quite weak in terms of its strategic orientation, and that would be applicable even, in my opinion, even to a lot of the people who are considered to be good trade union organisers, but they lacked a subtlety in the way they operated. And I think a lot of the sort of old Labour, in inverted commas, organisation has an element of that it sort of lacks a subtlety of organisation, and that remains to the case to this day.
Explain more closely these subtleties you speak of.
Well, there was a certain theory within the Labour movement that Stalinism, or the Soviet Union, was socialism. The objective, therefore, was to improve the condition of the workers in England, or in Britain, or in Germany, or in France, by taking industrial action that would eventually, if you like, with political organisation, would eventually bring about some sort of society which would make an alliance with the Soviet Union. I think that's, for example, how Arthur Scargill used to see things, and some of the left on the Labour Party used to see things like that as well.
So Arthur Scargill was the head of the miners'
head of the miners' union, particularly in very big strikes in the 70s. Saltley Gate, he was famous for organising a picketing campaign there, which defeated the government. And in 1984 to 85, there was a miners' strike, lasted a year, which they lost, and Arthur Scargill was the miners' union leader. So that orientation towards the Soviet Union in long-term political objective, overt sympathy, meant that there were large layers of the population who knew what the Soviet Union was like, who would never agree with you. That inability to find a pathway between those two courses simply lacked subtlety. But I think, because the subtlety that I thought was relevant was there's an alternative which is democratic socialist.
Which is neither.
But even that actually lacks subtlety, actually.
Why?
Because I think the idea of simply overthrowing the Soviet regime and establishing a Soviet power, I now think...
This was your hope for Russia?
Was my hope. Was actually utopian.
How weak were the political structures inside the Soviet Union at those times? How strong was that those organisations that you wished for to come to power?
The opposition movement was tiny, absolutely tiny. But the mass of the population were discontented. So this had an economic root, that the society was in a long-term stagnation or a long-term decline in growth, and therefore people didn't see, if you like, that people would ignore mistakes, errors, bureaucratic mismanagement, abuses of power, if they saw such rapid progress that those things that did go well were the main focus of their attention. If, on the other side, they saw most things in their everyday lives and in the general projects of the state not going particularly well, then they thought that the long-term prospects for their children and grandchildren were not great, and therefore they were discontented, which reflected itself in personal sort of lethargy and social lethargy as well, which could invert itself and turn into a social explosion, which is what did happen. That lethargy and discontent linked together, and they found expression in revolt against the system.
So do you see this lethargy around the West today?
The character of the regimes in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe was unique in the respect that power was so concentrated in a single organisational form that it was much easier to bring those regimes down than it is to bring down capitalism. Capitalism has multiple levels of power operation which are more difficult to overthrow as a whole.
Meaning, speak to these different levels of power.
Well, you have all the apparatus of democratic participation that's supposed to be there under modern capitalism. In theory, it is there. But many of these organizations, if not most of them, are actually instruments which are used by business interests, primarily business interests, to exert their authority over society.
So they have democratic forms but not democratic outcomes?
Not democratic content and not democratic outcomes either. Or better said, outcomes mediated by the interests of major corporations or of private interests, private business interests. And these are the generic form under which capitalism operates. Whereas if you've got, as in the Soviet Union, all property belonged to the state, or effectively corporate property belonged to the state. So a challenge to the political regime immediately brought into question the entire power of society, exercised in society. And that isn't the case today. I mean, there are people who would like people to understand that that's the case, and a lot of people in society do understand in some way or other that that is the case. But it's rare to find it's difficult to organise simultaneously against both those forces and to find people prepared to organise simultaneously against those forces. Whereas in the Soviet Union it was the default mode of conflict. That as soon as you entered in conflict against the state, you entered into conflict against the entire apparatus of power.
Well, I met you a few months ago at the Occupy London experiment, and it seemed to me like a lot of these political organisations that were, say, very strong 100 years ago, like communist groups or anarchist groups or workers' councils or these type of things, in the UK, for example, they simply do not exist anymore. And it seemed to me like that people were scrabbling to somehow come together with some kind of an organisational structure. How far away are we from anybody putting together anything that could coherently capture any element of power? Not even, I don't mean official power, but even an organisational power.
In that respect, I don't think we're all that far away. The ability to combine is greater than ever before. The will to combine is not yet. But that's what's lacking. That's the thing, is that shift out of lethargy towards activity, I think, will generally be a function of the working out of economic processes, which, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, will compel people to take some action. I mean, people in Greece don't want to protest.
Yeah, so things aren't bad enough here for anybody to get up and do stuff.
It's not that they're not bad enough. I don't think that's the criteria. It's that a certain combination of time and experience, of circumstances worsening or radically improving, it could be either, lead people to demand in a common and united front or action that change be brought about. And that combination becomes big enough to form itself into some organisational structure. Probably, in my opinion, I come from a tradition which tends to think that people will return to try and change what exists already. So perhaps, give a theoretical example that several million people join the trade unions all of a sudden, or that 300,000 people suddenly, quite radical people or activists, emerge, who then join the Labour Party. So that type of transition is what I'm really thinking is most likely. Partly because it's actually quite easy to do. It's really just a case of, do people stand up and take some action? And if they do, what are they going to think is the easiest?
With respect to the Labour Party and other, say, organised political groups, a lot of the younger people today, I think, don't see any prospects for progress through the existing political system.
Sure.
So personally, I would think that it's unlikely to come through some of these older channels, most people, if you talk to working class people nowadays, because they're so propagandized, they think unions are their enemy.
Sure.
I struggled. I think it'll come from somewhere quite totally different. It could come from the internet or something.
Well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that there are some points which are weak points within the existing order, and if those weak points are focused on, like I say, you're not talking about large numbers of people. A few million people is not that large a number. We've got 17 million people in Britain, 65 million. So a few million people getting involved in a trade union is not such a large amount. 300,000 people getting involved in the Labour Party would also not be such a large amount. Now that doesn't mean that those wouldn't be more. I mean, like last year there was a protest, or a trade union protest, but as I understand there were 500,000 people in the demonstration. So there is a contingent who in theory on a single demonstration could do that. They could just pass around the form or say, you pick up your iPhone now, send in your membership application, it's free today, right? Free membership for a year, and you can vote out Ed Miliband and vote in this person. Well, it's there to be done, isn't it? You know.
Sure it is.
I think the internet can foster that type of, or can facilitate
Quick
that type of
response,
process.
yeah.
And in that way, it's really a case of that lethargy being broken first of all, then it finding some form of focus. But the focus could be a number of different ways. I'm not excluding that it won't go many different ways, but I do think the tendency would be back towards, somehow it just seems easier to change what you already know.
Go back 100 years ago, the press was much more open. There were workers' papers that would sell a lot. Today, all that's gone. You've got the Sun and the News of the World, no more, and they're all owned by billionaires typically. So that element of working class news is gone. But the internet's here, and it's revolutionised the cost of producing, say, something like this podcast. You could never have done this 20 years ago. You would need to be an estate broadcaster to try and do it. It seems to me that it might have the same effect as, say, the pamphleteers had back hundreds of years ago, to make an opening into the society.
Yeah, one of the reasons I entered into conflict with various left-wing activists was the internet. I mean, I said to them in '95, I was arguing the internet can revolutionise the way that the revolutionary organisations operate and the labour movement operates. To this day, I am horrified at the way in which the left has been incapable of combining internationally to utilise the internet effectively. For example, everybody on the left will talk about globalisation, multinational companies, the need for international combination of the working class. For example, for workers in Apple and workers in Foxconn in China to link together. But the actual level of organisation by left-wingers or by trade unionists to make that happen is effectively zero. And it's quite astounding that, for example, the most elementary thing you would require would be a translator. You wouldn't read many. If you had one translator who dealt with translating from Chinese to English and English to Chinese, and Google does half the job for you in any case, merely to set up a correspondence link between trade unionists in the West who work in stores of Apple, trade unionists who transport goods on ships, and trade unionists who work in China in Foxconn. That would be three key links in a global chain of production that is at the very core of modern capitalism. And yet, that single person employed merely to campaign on this issue does not exist.
Facebook for the left.
Yes,
not to be facile, but like literally how to link people strategically.
Combined, and really, left-wing political groups are responsible for that incompetence, ineptitude, because some of them have those international links, but they just don't use them in that way. They use them instead in order, and this was a long debate I had with various left-wing groups, but particularly one that I was involved in, was why are you focusing in 2003 or 2002, I used to say, why are you focusing on producing a newspaper that nobody reads? And they insisted, they said, well, the newspaper, Lenin said, is the collective organiser. I see, yeah, but that was before there was the internet, you know. And even Lenin thought radio was the newspaper, of electronic newspaper of the age.
Yeah.
You know, when he came to power. So it's ridiculous. It's utterly, it's like Luddites, to be honest with you. I mean, at the early days when the web first came up, there was a group called Multinational Monitor, for example, and they were a publication which tried to monitor multinational companies around the world.
Yeah.
If that concept would have been developed by even just some international trade unions putting a little bit of money in, and some activists participating, whether voluntarily or on a finance base or raising money to do it, really you could have had a global network by now easily, which could have paralysed large corporations almost on demand, and instead of it's been left to sort of activists to run around and do things outside shops or things like that. And it's kind of sad. But if you like, it's pregnant. The situation is pregnant with it. So I'm still quite confident that these type of things will happen. It's just, you know, the role of activists in inverted commas or revolutionary groups is really to make sure this happens, rather than just to jump in on the bandwagon when it happens. Which is what I tend to find is the main problem. You know, the lack of strategic thinking is a terribly pathetic type of reflection on the weakness of the left.
The working man was sacrificed. Turned us into anarchists. Industrial revolution, our old life overthrown. So we came up with a solution, a revolution of our own. Met in the hills and plan to smash their weaving machines of gloom. Hear that sweet music as we bash. A what bopaluma, a what bamboo.
I met a guy on the Unions March that you were talking about earlier, and he was saying that how in 1936, when the Olympics were going to be held in fascist Germany under Hitler, that the left across the world basically decided to have their own Olympics. In Barcelona. Can you imagine that happening today? Can you imagine the organisational element?
They had tremendous organisational power in those days. That's
and that
true.
seems to be like probably maybe 100 years of this organisational power. That today, if we're anywhere, we're basically right at the beginning, starting from scratch.
It's funny, because there are contradictions in that. I mean, there were, for example, 1920s, 30s Germany, until Hitler came to power, there was a tremendously powerful communist movement and social democratic movement, both of which had large-scale organisations, several, even local daily newspapers. They had weekly photographic magazines, like workers' photographers. They had artist groups. They had sports groups, children's groups, women's groups. You know, you name it. Each sport, they would have trade union or workers' activists who were involved in this specific sport. You know, it's true that there was. We're quite a different phase. Having said that, do you need those organisations in order to bring about social change? Not per se. I mean, it's nice to bring about change in all different spheres of society, that's true. But if you could, I think the overthrow of the existing order, if you like, to put it in a grand term, doesn't require that. It requires a more focused attack on the dominant structures of power and wealth. And that, I think, is at least in theory, is possible without having these mass encroachment on the civil society of capitalism.
Back in the 1920s, if there was a strike, maybe the army or the National Guard was sent in and they might just shoot a few people dead. The worker had a fair idea who was in charge and who maybe was their class enemy. Today, I think a lot of people that would instinctively be quite maybe radical or left-wing get jobs within the system, maybe as an environmentalist here or as a community organisers over there, and that the system itself seems to have learnt how to cope and to manage the more radical elements and make them exist within the system in a certain way that's not, in direct competition with the system, and that there isn't that knowledge of Who's the class enemy?
Well, I mean, to some degree, you've got a blurring of the edges of what is the target. That's why I said specifically the focal point for the overthrow of the existing order, if you like, has to be a bit more concentrated as a concept. Take, for example, this Olympic opening ceremony, the big focus on the National Health Service, which, I mean, you know, anybody who's left-wing is bound to think, okay, that's kind of cool that they did that. Well, the National Health Service is a giant state organisation, one that has enormous bureaucratic flaws. But almost everyone on the left and most people on the right will support the existence of the NHS. Well, that's definitely a gain for the left, historically, that such a concept exists in society. And in the 1920s, the NHS didn't exist. And therefore, the concept of what the target is different. I mean, nationalising healthcare is no longer the issue. It's about maintaining public healthcare and improving the quality of it and integrating it perhaps better in society. So there are some aspects, I mean, public education is another sphere. Even policing, actually, which for many on the left is a big issue. But actually, in other respects, you'll encounter police in many other circumstances where they're not the enemy, per se. Really, the focal point about where is the real concentration of power. That's what my main interest is. And I think that many of those other aspects, to some degree, the right wing and the Thatcherites are right that the left has conquered in those spheres. You might even say the media. Yes, the media is biased, but you'll find left-wingers within the media. If you go into institutions like the BBC, everywhere you go, you'll be meeting left-wingers who are journalists and left-wingers who are producers and so on.
But they're not allowed to talk left.
Well, they're not allowed to talk overtly left. They try their little way to get something through.
But you would be allowed to talk overtly right on the BBC.
Yeah, well, their editorial process sifts out, controls, eliminates and so on. But it is also true that the institution itself is not the object which needs, if you like, overthrowing or smashing. Rather, that there's a structure of control within it that should be overthrown, and then a reorganisation of the form through democratisation, through participation, working out new structures, theorising different ways of organising, and theorising a different world, really, as a general concept, linking together everything, you know, whether it be healthcare, education, policing, you need, if you like, a generalist concept about the type of society you want to become very widespread, and that then will allow people to focus on bringing about the changes inside organisations that will revolutionise society in a way that perhaps would be far higher level than you would have had in the 30s or the 20s.
So you've spent some time in China. Can you talk about the conditions of workers there? You've got some experience of this.
There is a big debate about China, what the character of China is, both within the left and within the right. One example, just to starkly contrast what these views basically are. I read a document just yesterday from some people I used to do political work with. One of my major conflicts with them was about China. And basically the document says China is a slave labour state. I mean, that's effectively what they're saying. Capitalist, multinational, slave labour exploitation. And that's why China's growing, because they've got loads of cheap labour, they're exploiting them ruthlessly, and at a certain point, people are going to say, I'm not having it anymore, and we're going to overthrow this state and the Communist Party, and we'll have something, either genuine communism or, I don't know, whatever else. Doing a little bit of research a couple of days ago for an article, I stumbled across a law that has been passed in Shanghai municipality. Shanghai is probably the wealthiest municipality in the whole of China. The law that was passed last year, in May last year, which grants all workers in all factories and all workplaces the right to elect the managers, recall the managers, and control the entire work process. Now, just the same as when Chomsky refers to statutes that existed in trade unions and so on in the 1970s. This is a statute introduced last year in China, in Shanghai, in the number one metropolis of China. Now, does that mean that exists
In reality?
In reality, no, it doesn't. But it does mean that the legal framework for people to struggle to bring that about is there. When people say, I want to elect a manager, they're only demanding what the law says. So actually, the police, the judges, the institutions officially have to support them. So it's a very peculiar circumstance. You can't really say it's a slave labour society. Where
Are there elements of it that are like say, the Foxconn element that make Apple products?
Oh, yeah.
What's the conditions like there now?
This is, if you like, Marx's description of the proletariat was the bringing together of hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands of workers. In the case of Foxconn, near Shenzhen, the plant it's estimated to have 400,000 workers in a single location, which is probably the biggest factory ever created. It's quite a low-level factory in the sense it's an assembly plant. It's not really it is high-tech in some parts. So it's a combination. I mean, they are making these high-tech equipment, and some of the places are sort of completely sanitized scientific instrument centers, but still the work is detail, manual labor. The added value is not that great, though, of what they do, what the actual workers in China do. So most of it is putting things together.
That was designed in Japan.
That was designed or even manufactured in Japan or in Korea or so on. But wages are quite low, but compared with, people generally consider their wages in comparison to other people and their past condition. So if you've got 2,700 yuan in China, which is about £270 a month, and you've got dormitory accommodation and food, you're not that badly off, to be honest. It's not great income.
And are they working 7 days a week?
Well, that depends on the workplaces. The law in China, again, specifies a 48-hour maximum working week with, I think, I can't remember the exact amount, a certain amount of overtime you can do per month, which is limited as well. But a lot of workers themselves will break those rules to try and earn extra money, and employers will break the rules. So really it's a case of organising. People need to organise, and of course all sorts of things are done to try and prevent people organising. But officially the laws all exist for you to do things. Actually, the way the Chinese work is not by not having rights, but by having the rights in such detail that every time you want to ask for it, they've already got it worked out how to trick you. So you go up one level, and then they say, okay, go to so-and-so on number 15, he's responsible for that, because you have to find him, and then, you find him, then he's got someone who's responsible for the next level up, and so they tie people up in bureaucratic knots. So, for example, like I said, the law on the workers' congresses, I read it, astounded, looking at every single piece of long law, every piece of it, pretty much was very progressive. And you'd think, if I was to work out how you could run a society, you could sit down and try and make out a plan and write out how it should actually be organised, and you think that type of law might be the type of thing you'd pass. But then if you think about it carefully, each of those different regulations are ways of tying you up in bureaucratic knots. So it's a dilemma, but provided people if people have the will to take action, to take control, which definitely happens in China. China's probably the country with the most revolts at the moment, and the most successful revolts. Then they can enforce the laws and change them. Foxconn, for example, has been massive rise in wage. I think 40% rise in wages since the suicides. I had a debate I wrote some documents criticising the famous Hungarian economist János Kornai. He's the main sort of theorist of socialism. He was somebody who thought that the system could be reformed. So he was a leading economist in Hungary, criticised the system. Then he wrote this famous book called The Political Economy of Socialism. And he concluded that China was capitalist, and I disagree, because the dominant sectors of the economy are planned, and they're publicly owned and planned. And by dominant sectors, I mean the banks and the largest industries. But his argument was quite weak. It wasn't really based on a lot of detail, which to some degree I wrote to him personally, and he wrote back, and he was quite interested in the idea. In any case, he certainly didn't reject it. He just wasn't certain because he hasn't been following. He's quite an old man now, and he hasn't been following Chinese political economy in enough detail to make a proper statement about it. But I think that basically the publicly owned sector of the economy, which is the large banks, or all the major banks, the state industries, local government, nearly all the limited companies that are registered on the stock exchange are still publicly owned companies, state-owned companies. Most of the joint ventures are actually controlled by the state, or at least they have a determining influence in the fate of those companies. Even a lot of foreign companies, really, they only can do anything with the permission of the state. And so if you combine together all these apparatuses with the law, education, the media, welfare institutions, trade unions, all these institutions are all part of the state. And so once you link together all the chains that connect together this old apparatus of the state that has been expanding actually, then you begin to get a picture of a sort of an apparatus, a bureaucratic apparatus that is controlling Chinese economy and society that has got really, it's not a capitalist apparatus, it's just not the same structure.
And what is the rising power, say, of oligarchs in China?
There are networks of criminal elites who've stolen money from the people, or stolen property from the people. I say stolen because I'm talking about the illegal appropriation of wealth. And then there are people who've made money as business people. Some of them are legitimately, legitimate to a normal capitalist type of business. Well, without specifically breaking the law. That's what I mean. They tend to be weaker. So the capitalists who have acquired money through, let's say, running a pig farm and extending it across the country, or opening a chain of restaurants that's gone franchised across the country, some of them, because of the size of the country, they've become multimillionaires or billionaires. Does that mean that they have the corresponding power that you might normally expect someone like that to have in the West? No, it doesn't. There was a case recently where a woman was tried for borrowing money from other people to run her business, and the business couldn't pay back the money, and then all of a sudden she was put on trial. They were going to carry out the death penalty. Actually, it was commuted to life imprisonment, I think. But the fact that someone can be threatened with a death penalty for borrowing money is really quite an extraordinary phenomenon for a country that's supposed to be a capitalist country. And you can't borrow money from the state. In theory, you could bribe the state bank manager to lend you some money. But generally, the state banks only lend to state organisations. Having said that, there is some crossover between what is now state and what is private. I mean, obviously, significant sections of the elite try or want these big companies to become their personal possession. But the whole apparatus of the state, of communist party as a whole, the apparatus of the military, the apparatus of the judiciary, augurs all against that process. So generally what you find is there's a wave of corruption, then a wave of anti-corruption campaigning, people go to jail, people put in prison, then a new level of corruption emerges, then the same process happens. Because things have been going very well, there's no real reason for them to change their model as it stands at the moment. I mean, the economy is growing faster than any other economy in human history. Why should they bother to change their model?
How do the Chinese see the geopolitics of, say, America putting more troops into East Asia and Australia?
The very strong growth of the economy has certainly generated a powerful nationalist sentiment within the population, and to a significant degree within sections of the army. Also, they feel that they were pushed around a long time, and now they can exercise a bit of power themselves. But having said that, it's at the moment, it still remains quite minor. Generally, Chinese empires, even in the past, have focused on internal control of China, which itself is, if you could call an empire. I mean, there are different nationalities, different regions of China, some of whom claim the right to separation. Generally, it's almost impossible for them to separate. But in general, I can't see a war breaking out anytime soon. The Chinese, I think, are more aware of their ability to reject decisions made in the West, and to embarrass the authorities in the West by simply not abiding by what the West might want. And certainly they're quite aware that they're extremely powerful at the moment in comparison with the United States. I mean, in the sense of their economic growth, of the sense of progress, whereas certainly the United States does not experiencing a period of enormous feeling of growth and progress and development. It's a period of self-reflection, of deep crisis, recession. Of deep recession, of poverty, of consideration about their internal stability. Not that there's no discussion of internal stability in China, it's just that the Western system appears to be in a much bigger crisis than the Chinese system is, and I think that's legitimate.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about today?
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about was this. My main consideration, someone asked me yesterday, what do I stand for and what do I think? And really, I think the main consideration of my whole life has been about a critique of Stalinism. Ever since I started speaking at Speaker's Corner, people ask me, and before, why I got involved in Marxism, people ask me, what do you think of the Soviet Union, or what do you think about so-called communist countries? So I feel like that's really what my main focus is to this day, which is also why I take this position towards China, that I look at it critically, but if you like, with a positive criticism. I think that's the way to approach the question. You look at what they do and you see what aspects of that could be democratized and turned into instruments of genuine socialistic cooperation, coordination, and a better life for all. And I think that same attitude can be applicable to elements of the state in the West. I mean, for example, the health service, education, and so on. It's not sufficient merely to look at how things are and criticise what the Tories are doing, the cuts that they make. You also have to construct an alternative critique of the existing way in which things have been formed and organised, and propose alternatives, perhaps within, become aware of how these structures actually operate, and propose alternative ways in which they could be created or transformed into the future. So that's the type of debate I think that really needs to take place, or discussions that need to take place, to formulate a new mass socialist movement.
I find personally that it took me a lot of reading before I even came across what are structural arguments that today in the media, what's put forward as intellectual thought leaders, it's really pathetic for someone to get to hear structural descriptions of stuff. They either have to nearly stumble across Marx or a Marxist group. It seems to me very hard for people to actually get to hear these structural descriptions of society that they would probably totally agree with.
Yeah, I met a young kid yesterday. I do these Marx walking tours, and I met a young kid yesterday. He said, all the young kids, he goes, they're all into the Illuminati. But on the other side, there is an element to that. It's a sloppy way of thinking, because it means you're not responsible for thinking what it is. You just think it's all conspiracy. But in a way, the way they try and link these things together is an indication of a sort of thirst for an idea of some comprehension of the totality. It's a pathetic way of doing it, but it is a way. It's an infantile way of doing it. But it does indicate a certain consciousness that there can be more than the sum of the parts, that there can be some sort of totality which controls things or which organises things, or perhaps better, like what you're implying and what my basic view is that there is a totality which you can observe and can be to a large degree understandable. The dynamics of society can be comprehended. I mean, you're never going to understand everything, but you can be largely comprehended, and that just gives you that edge in understanding how you fit into the world and how things can be changed. It gives you a certain perspective on the world, which allows you perhaps not to panic. Don't panic.
There was a boxer who fought Ricky Hatton a few years ago, and his tagline was, "Don't panic, I'm Hispanic." Juan, don't panic, I'm Hispanic.
Yeah, there was a program. They got one of the guys at Speaker's Corner. This guy who went to jail for 7 years, Belmarsh, Mohammed Hamid. They made a program about him. The BBC made a program about him called "Don't Panic, I'm Islamic," and then they used the film of him shooting paintballs for the BBC program as proof that he was trained to be a terrorist.
I think I was there the day he came back from prison, and
that's the other. That's Musa Brown. He was let out. Yeah.
What got him sent down was he was saying that they translated an Arabic conversation he was having with his friend in France about his new phone, and he said in Arabic, does it have Bluetooth? And the translation went something like, does it have the ability to remotely detonate a bomb? And he got 12 months in.
Well, he was actually on remand all the time. He didn't get sentenced to anything. He was on remand 18 months, and then they let him go. So, but the other guys went down. But don't panic. I think it's, because the tendency for a lot of leftists will be to panic and say, and to see the revolution around the corner. And I spent too long in my life thinking there's a revolution around the corner. Proper thinking through things is the basis for preparing for a revolution, in my opinion. Properly thinking through what's going on, where we're at, and where we're going. That's a more stable way of relating to social change than sort of running around selling newspapers and shouting at people,
Thanks very much, Heiko, for the interview today.
Welcome. Should we go and get a cup of tea?
Yeah.
You get like a Khoo. For the price of a night with me, you be the village Joe. For the price of a pint of milk, I'll tell you all I know about the state of the world today. Sit down, enjoy the show.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune Shine On You Crazy Scumbag by Clive Star. Animal Love, Animal Lunch, also by Clive Star, replete with excerpts of Heath Ledger as the Joker from the movie The Dark Knight, and the Luddite song from the BBC children's programme Horrible Histories.
You get a 7-inch shot.
To play us out, we have Belle and Sebastian singing For the Price of a Cup of Tea.
You can use my stereo.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you join me for the next episode From Alpha to Omega.